Hey, what's up, everyone? So today we are talking about reparations. This is going to be a two-part video. The first part right here is going to talk about why reparations are being requested. And then the second part of the second video will cover what they would look like, how they would be paid for, and why they should be given. So there are many different arguments people are throwing around right now against the notion of reparations. It's hard to keep track of all of that. However, I will say whether you look at it specifically as being for ADOS people or American descendants of slavery, or for all African Americans, if you prefer that viewpoint, either way doesn't change the edict of this video. However, the argument for reparations is vastly simpler, more straightforward, and well anchored than many of us are led to believe. Many people have written extensively and vibrantly on this topic in support of reparations as well, including Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, which is a great read I suggest you check out on the Atlantic's website, as well as Sandy Darity's 40 Acres and a Mule in the 21st Century, which was published in Social Science Quarterly, and you can also find it through your local research periodical channels or through Google. So, why are reparations being requested? Well, after being captured and sold by our fellow Africans, just over 350,000 African people from various areas of Western Africa were dragged to the American colonies by sea, where many died in transit. Upon arrival, Africans were stripped of human rights, enslaved, brutally treated, and considered lesser than their fellow human beings. We were changed from humans into things to justify our abuse, and the discrimination and violation of our human rights did not end after slavery was abolished. From black codes all the way to mass anti-black terrorism, African Americans were stripped of their rights in America well into the 1960s. So fast forward to 2008, the election of President Obama, historic marker in time for the United States. The election of its first black president gave the country a sense of proof positive arrival at a mostly post-racial social climate. It gave the black community a sense of pride that one of their own had ascended to the highest position of power in the world, and that our children now could do the same. Some Americans even felt they had now settled up their oppression of blacks and that it really wasn't even a thing anymore. Unfortunately, a lot of that wasn't true. Under Obama's administration, the black family continued to fall short of the American dream as the racial wealth gap grew with a fierce, unwavering conviction of the red, white, and blue flag. 2017 census poverty data showed that African Americans, making up just under 13% of the American population, 23% of America's poverty-stricken citizens were black. That is, America had swallowed an entire 21% of the black community in its economic underbelly. But as we know, the official poverty rate is widely accepted as being inadequate. So based on how the national poverty rate triples when compared to just twice the threshold, I'd easily say that well over a third of blacks today struggle to make ends meet. Accordingly, blacks have essentially lived as a underclass, a third world life in the foremost first world country on the planet. The dangers of places such as the south side of Chicago, the east side of Detroit, and parts of even Washington, D.C. and Atlanta prove this point excellently, in addition to other major black urban neighborhoods throughout the country. Not all, but a lot. Where in these spaces, we experience life on eggshells while still living in food deserts at the same time. Well, some people ask, well, why is that? America has a strong history of setting up policies and institutions that minimize or cut out black people from, in general, accessing the American dream on the same terms as both white Americans and even other minority groups after those minority groups had been given their own equal, equitable access to honorary whiteness or the full unrestricted benefits of American citizenship. Believe it or not, some of those groups even actually came in and gained their access through assisting in the continued abuse and oppression of blacks in this country. But those are just a few of the most vigorating motives of reparations. But those are not the drivers. Those are the resulting outcomes of the oppression I'm about to describe, which are the hard and fast drivers for the required compensation and restitution claim. And to be clear, no one is asking for equal outcomes We're demanding equitable opportunity proportionate to the contributions and the time we have in this country, which have been subverted by vicious actors and institutions operating in illicit and malice, in aid to or unchecked by the American government that was supposed to protect us. What is wrong today was wrong in 1980, 1920, 1860, and will be in 2040. There is no excuse. There are only excuses. So let me run down these bullets that will put holes in the idea that nothing is old. Let's start off with number one, forced chattel slavery. That alone is the largest single factor and drove this country into a civil war. Number two, retraction of 40 acres and a mule. That actually was a demand from black community leaders when William Sherman asked what we needed in order to take care of ourselves independently after emancipation. It was approved by President Lincoln, then revoked by President Johnson less than a year later. Black families lost most of that land. Some got to keep it, but all of them needed it. This was a pivotal point where a lot of wealth potential that made sense to give to newly freed former slaves to enable them to take care of themselves was denied with no reasonable alternatives given. That's why people often reference this term 40 acres and a mule, because it was such a pivotal loss. And we need to get back to that in a modern sense. Therefore, it is used by Sandy Darity as a foundation for the calculation of the magnitude of reparations owed today. And clearly, it's now more expensive and more complicated, but neither of those realities are justifications for its denial. Number three, black codes. Black codes in the South, a system of laws that were passed by Southern states in 1865 and 66 in reaction to after the Civil War in reaction to the 13th Amendment. These were in effect restricting African Americans' freedom and forcibly compelling them to work in a labor economy based on low wages or debt. Hence, number four, sharecropping came about. Blacks still didn't have their own land or opportunity for non-labor work to earn a living. So they were growing crops on rented land using rented tools, both of which were rented at predatory rates, which fluctuated at the will of the owners. And if they were in debt to the landowner at the end of the season, which occurred often due to predatory rates and harvest performance, in many cases, they couldn't leave the farm. And if they were caught running away, they would be returned by law enforcement in chains to the very same farm. If not returned, what they could be sent off to is prison, where they'd be put into forced labor with even less freedom. So as long as the owner made sure that the sharecroppers never made a profit, they were constrained to the farms just as effectively as an actual slave before them, and they were underpaid just as effectively. Number five, convict leasing. So as I said, you could go to jail. A system expanded throughout the South with the emancipation of slaves, where a majority black convict population was all but written off to private corporations for use as forced labor. They received no compensation. They done dangerous back-breaking work. Meanwhile, the states that ran the prisons or the convict leasing programs reaped huge revenue and benefit. That's why both convict leasing and sharecropping, to a lesser extent, were known as slavery by another name, which of course benefited white life, since number six, Jim Crow laws allowed the government to make endless, well-funded public spaces into whites-only spaces, and accordingly fostered the ability to allocate minimal resources to the supposedly equal black spaces, but in reality, they left them consistently inferior in comparison. And in some cases, there weren't even black spaces available at all. These laws also served as an engine for destruction of black wealth, using various pseudo-legal mechanisms to steal land from blacks who had it. Then, to drive the point home, all the way home, literally, we got number seven, redlining, which underpinned the denial of blacks' reasonable access to home ownership, thus the denial of more land and wealth accruement. Similar to Jim Crow, redlining further cemented racial segregation and fostered this dastardly level of misappropriation of infrastructural resources down to the neighborhood level, okay? And that ushered in creation of ghettos in a way that was so deep that its effects now drive modern urban planning and civil engineering issues to this day. Then that leads us to number eight, mass anti-black terrorism, a continuum of acts that started right up in 1865 and go all the way to this day, where black men and women were targeted by non-black individuals and organizations to end their lives or reduce their freedom through intimidation, including stopping blacks from voting. These organizations, of course, included the KKK and then lesser organized groups of white terrorists engaged in lynchings and mobbings of all sorts. Some of their most infamous productions, unfortunately, include Black Wall Street and Rosewood. And there are many more and more cases that I can't even get into right now. There are just so many more. But what's so crazy is that they had to come out of the white neighborhoods and go into the black neighborhoods to do this. So this was clearly targeted. It was illegal at the time and beyond immoral, dead-on terrorism costing thousands of lives. So number 9, the war on drugs. This was a federally initiated, incentivized, and bankroll process of targeting elimination of drugs most commonly used in poor, desperate neighborhoods, labeling their users as everything but children of God. The war on drugs caused soaring arrest rates that disproportionately targeted African Americans with no regard for where the drugs came from or even why we were using them. This helped increase the rates of number 10, mass incarceration. The systematic over-penalization of blacks when compared to non-blacks for a given crime. The process clearly seemed to be pigeonholing African Americans into economic exclusion due to their criminal records. Also, a lot of blacks were and still are pulled over and harassed for extremely minor stuff today, which is part of the excuse for number 11, police brutality. The most recently prevailing form of public execution of black people, typically shootings of unarmed and unthreatening black men and women by police officers who themselves are acting in manners that are clearly overly aggressive given the situation's circumstances. Then the same officers are not being held accountable for their negligence to strive to preserve life in the process of enforcing law. That means that it was never their concern. And it was shoot now and ask questions later, especially if they're black. And again, no long-term considerations or discussion about why the alleged offenses were being committed in the first place. All of these acts or systems were either carried out by the federal government, federally illegal, but carried out by state and local governments unchecked, or of a highly wicked intent, although not explicitly illegal at the time, would be deemed terrible today. All of these issues compose one of the worst human rights violations of all time against a single group of people, one of the, not the only. And any entities engaging in such extreme schemes would have to answer for them today. All of these actions dehumanized, impoverished, killed countless people, countless human lives lost over petty racism, born on fallacious beliefs of inferiority, perpetuated for the construction of the richest country in the world, without much, if any, formal atonement for the actions of the perpetuators to this day. So all of these items fall under the responsibility of the U.S. federal government to address. Even if the government chooses to, divvy up responsibility on a state-by-state basis, or even down to a local or corporation government level, or a local government or corporation level. The discussion starts on Capitol Hill, and that can also include discussions about the U.S. government even thinking about delegating some of the responsibilities back to foreign actors, such as Benin, Britain, or even the transporting slave ship owning companies. Some of them still exist. We have to start the conversation somewhere and with the right people on the legislative record that cannot be retracted. Although through all of this, blacks are made a permanent underclass of the United States. They ensured an exploitable labor pool for the country's explosive growth. And within the physical confines of the black community, societal issues at large became intensified like a flashlight turning into a laser, especially when it comes to the guns and drugs and larceny. It denied generation after generation access to good jobs, to good homes, to neighborhoods that were taken care of, and education that was funded and properly kept up. Now we have the modern day ghetto or hood as a result. And the law enforcement is sent in to levy very vigorous and very vigorous and discriminatory policing and sentencing. Blacks still make up less than 13% of the U.S. population, as I said earlier, and we make up 40% of the incarcerated people in America. So today on paper, as I said, we're supposedly equal to the same. We're supposedly having access to all the same rights afforded to American citizens, but we were never allowed to build that intergenerational wealth or establish the networks, communities, neighborhoods, organizations, institutions, or similar with capacity commensurate to how long we've been in this country and the wealth representative of our contributions to this country, both of which are required to compete in this country today. Let me repeat, we have not been allowed to build a community with capacity commensurate to how long we've been in this country with the wealth representative of our contributions to this country, both of which are required to compete in this country today. I'm not talking individually, I'm talking as a community on a whole average level. Therefore, although we can build from scratch individually, we do not stand a reasonable chance of catching up or getting in alignment, getting the community in alignment with the economic machine this country is moving at, the rate this country is moving at. And we won't have the levels of wealth that we should have had these offenses not occurred earlier, or at least been stopped and addressed at some point prior to this. The racial wealth gap is simply a manifestation of all the things I just spoke about rolled up into today's present. And it's impossible for the people who were the underbelly of this country for nearly 400 years to get any better without transformational economic and political change focused on us and our unique claim. These people are overwhelmingly American descendants of slavery, ADOS people, and also to some degree, Black immigrants can have been caught in the crossfire too due to their melanin and being here after 65 and so as well. But this is primarily a push from the ADOS community with people having lineage going back to American slavery. Now, this is not minimizing or dismissing Black immigrants' histories in this country or their histories abroad or in their home countries, but the Native Black or ADOS community will not accept any decrement of compensation for the Native Blacks in order to free up funds justified for the disbursements to Black immigrants. The United States government will have to increase the amount of resources available in order to cover them in addition to us. Okay, so I just want to say in conclusion on this point, there's an overdue restitution, overdue compensation and redress due for this and variety of offenses levied directly by or by proxies acting in favor of the American government. And aka, honestly, the sovereign will of the American people. Based on popular sovereignty, nothing was done that wasn't either the majority population's desire or the elected officials that they put into place's desire. So these actions didn't happen against the will of the American people for the most part. Therefore, just as Black descendants from slavery inherited the baggage of their ancestors being denied the opportunity and the full rights of American citizenship, new immigrants and whites, unfortunately, will have to inherit the baggage of facing these unaddressed massive systemic wrongings, even ones committed before their own birth or their own arrival in this country, because they are still unaddressed and this government is responsible. Just as Lincoln said, slavery and all disguised forms of it are a massive injustice and deprive our republic of its just influence in this world. So I just wanted to leave you guys with that. I'm going to do another video and we're going to talk about a little bit more detail behind how reparations would work and who would pay for them, and a little bit more moral, ethical grounding behind why they should be discussed and actually implemented. Thank you, everyone. I'm Vel. Take care.